All right. Hey, everybody. It's Evan from Fight for the Future, and welcome back to our brand new weekly live stream, which I guess we're calling Fight for the Future Live. So big ups to Joe Thornton, who's always kind of behind the scenes here, pushing buttons and moving knobs and making the hamsters run on the wheels to make all the technology here work. We've got a pretty exciting episode today. We're talking about facial recognition surveillance. And this is an issue that's been in the news quite a bit. And Fight for the Future, my organization, launched a major campaign last week at banfacialrecognition.com, becoming one of the first major national organizations to call for a complete and total ban at the federal level on law enforcement and government use of facial recognition surveillance technology. And there's a number of different organizations out there working on this issue. There's a lot of reasons to be concerned about this type of invasive surveillance that's being deployed both by private companies as well as by law enforcement and government agencies. And there was a really major story that broke in the Washington Post, I guess now 2 weekends ago. And we're really lucky to be joined today by one of the people who helped kind of put together the research and information that led to that major story. So we have with us Clare Garvie, who is with the Georgetown Law Center for Privacy and Technology. She's an expert on biometric surveillance and facial recognition surveillance, and has been doing work on this issue for quite some time. Clare, how's it going?
It's going well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Super stoked to have you. And to folks who are out there watching, this is a really awesome opportunity for you to get your questions answered. So if you're sitting at home being like, why should I care about facial recognition? Like, I have nothing to hide. Or if you're saying like, hey, this is going to keep us safe, I like it. Or if you're just, confused and don't understand why an organization like Fight for the Future that works on issues like internet freedom and net neutrality and internet privacy cares about this issue, now's your chance. So feel free to jump in the chat and ask questions, and we'll do our best to jump on them as well. But Clare, to start, can you just give us a little overview for maybe folks who missed it? What was this big story in the Washington Post about ICE and its use of facial recognition surveillance? And why is it so significant? And why has it kind of sparked such a major debate about this type of surveillance tech?
Sure. So as a bit of background, we've been researching the use of face recognition by law enforcement for about 4 years now. And what we found is that most American adults are in a face recognition database that's accessible for criminal justice searches thanks to getting a driver's license. Driver's licenses in 32 or more states are face recognition optimized and can be searched maybe by the FBI, by state and local police. And then our most recent research has found that ICE has access as well in a number of states. We don't know what the scope of this is, but we do know that in Vermont and in Washington, this has happened. And then in Utah, this is likely has been happening up until maybe now, or it is continuing, where ICE can send in a request for a search of the driver's license database. This is why it's such a problem in Washington, Vermont, and Utah, and why it would be a problem in many contexts, but in a handful of states across the country. And that's because these states allow, under state law, allow undocumented immigrants to receive a driver's license or driver privilege card. So they have extended the right to drive to undocumented immigrants, but are turning around and sharing that information with ICE, which is, in my view, a crazy betrayal of trust on the part of these agencies.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of unbelievable to think about, right? Like, I would imagine people fought really hard for that right to get driver's licenses, since driver's licenses are so essential, especially in rural areas, for being able to meaningfully participate in society, like pick up and drop off your kids, get to work. And so people are kind of, fought hard for the right of undocumented people to be able to access that. And then the government turned around and essentially used it to target people. It seems like, the way that this is now being used for immigration enforcement has really kind of like elevated the conversation about how facial recognition in general exacerbates existing forms of discrimination and racial injustice that already exist within the criminal justice system and immigration system. Can you touch on that a little bit too? There's been a lot of discussion about racial bias within facial recognition surveillance. How do these things all connect? What's the connection kind of between the government using this to target undocumented people and the ways that it's being used, say, in a city like Detroit?
Face recognition risks exacerbating existing disparities within our criminal justice system. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that communities of color who are historically over-policed are disproportionately likely to be the targets of the use of new technologies, including face recognition. We have evidence of this from San Diego. Documents that we received from San Diego indicate that they know they're using license plate readers and face recognition technology between 1.5 and 2.5 times more on communities of color than the proportion of their proportion of the population in San Diego. So disproportionately targeted by this technology. Then on the other side, face recognition runs against databases. The only people who can be identified are the folks in the database. Most of these law enforcement systems run against mugshot databases at least. Mm-hmm. Well, guess who is disproportionately likely to be arrested, even if they're not charged or ultimately convicted of a crime? That is predominantly young Black men, meaning that they are disproportionately likely to be in these databases. Right. And then add on top of that the fact that face recognition makes mistakes. It's not the most accurate technology right now, and it makes more of a certain type of mistake on people with dark skin, as well as on women and young people. Why is this? It's for a number of different reasons. We hypothesize, researchers think that this is because the training data sets on which these algorithms are trained are disproportionately white men. It may also be a feature of the hardware of photography. Historically in this country, photography has built around taking high quality photos of white faces, not of darker skin faces. So and that's something that face recognition has to contend with. So there may be a disproportionate risk of misidentification for people of color, because it gets a little more nuanced, and researchers will say, hey, the research you're looking at says that there are what's called false non-match rates, missed identifications, if you will. That's disproportionately likely to happen with dark faces. But the way face recognition systems work is that law enforcement will put in a probe photo and they'll get a list of candidates back. Well, if they're looking for a Black face, it means, and it's more likely to miss the true identification. What that means is that the candidate list is more likely then to be completely innocent individuals. So the person that's landed up investigated or maybe charged with a crime, it may be more likely that that person is completely innocent.
Yeah, that's so important, because I feel like, a lot of the discussion that I've seen in the press lately is, really focuses on that inaccuracy, kind of narrowly focuses on the point of like, oh, the technology is not good enough yet at identifying Black and brown faces, or women, or trans folks, et cetera. And that's obviously important because there's like really, it's not hard to imagine the like real life consequences. It's not just like, oops, the machine made a mistake. It's like, this could lead to someone being shot by the police because they're suspected of being a suspect of a violent crime when they're not. It could lead to someone being wrongfully incarcerated or deported or, otherwise targeted by the government. So it makes sense to kind of focus on that. But I think what you just said, really illuminates that more, that even if the tech advances, even if, tech companies or the companies that make these products are able to sort of fix, quote unquote, this problem of misidentification, and the tech worked well 100% of the time, it's still basically going to be amplifying or exacerbating existing forms of discrimination in the criminal justice system, because they're basically checking against, like you said, mugshot databases or databases that are going to be disproportionately populated by people who are already targeted by the criminal justice system. So it's sort of just like it's like an intensifier, basically, even if it were to work perfectly. And I think that's like a really important point to underline. especially, from our perspective, one of the reasons we went ahead and called for a straight outright ban on this is because it feels like the industry wants to have a conversation around like, oh yeah, like there's some problems with the technology, but just like give us some like regulation or some transparency or some oversight, and like we promise we'll fix them all, and like this is going to be great. And it feels like they're kind of trying to skip a really important step of the debate, which is like, should this even exist at all? Like, is this something more like nuclear or biological weapons that like if we could go back in time and decide never to invent them, we probably would. And so I think it's important that we have the debate of like, should this type of tool be in law enforcement's hands in the first place, rather than just like, okay, let's just assume that it is, and let's assume that we're going to spread it everywhere. Like, how should we do it, or what kinds of protections should be in place? Really quick, I just want to, there's been a little bit of discussion in the chat, and maybe, one of these questions might be worth answering. Earlier up, and it looks like some of these are crossed out. So maybe Joe, you already kind of responded, but someone was just sort of asking like, this technology has been available, they're saying on the deep web, but I kind of imagine, there's obviously like commercial like versions of facial recognition or, different ways that people have been doing this on the internet for a while, or even like, stuff like Facebook's Face ID, et cetera. So why is there so much discussion about this now? Or like, why is this something that like, we should care about, considering that it has been around for a little bit?
So I think part of that comes down to a question of transparency. Yes, I think the oldest system that we know of face recognition used by law enforcement started in 2001. So it's certainly been around for a while. And then there was a huge push in like 2012, 13 for face recognition to be adopted both in driver's license databases and by law enforcement. But it's really only in the last few years that we have a better understanding as to the scale, the scope of how often it's used. There was also a breakthrough in terms of accuracy and availability of this technology, its capacity, recently with the move to machine learning and the fact that machine learning now underpins the training for this technology. And what that means is, yes, it's going to become more accurate, which makes it a more appealing tool for use by law enforcement and by various other agencies. In terms of why we should care about it now, in an ideal world, we would have been having these hard discussions about the risks and the benefits back in 2001.
Right, and certainly folks like you all have been trying to get those conversations going for a while, right?
Yeah, so yes, there's certainly, I wish we would have the conversations. It's always easier to talk about regulation or maybe prohibiting it in certain circumstances or in all circumstances before it's adopted at all, but we're just not at that point. It's been adopted and we need to contend with that now. The one other point I will say on accuracy, because we were talking about it and you mentioned it may be that we get to a point where the companies say this technology is super accurate now, all the accuracy problems are gone. I would caution against that logic for anyone who thinks, yes, we're going to get to a point where the accuracy, the mistake issue is solved. What we're finding is the way law enforcement in particular uses technology, there are so many human decision points and subjective decisions that humans make in the process that it doesn't matter how accurate the technology is. If there are humans still making all sorts of choices, it may never be in reality that accurate. And here's an example of this. The NYPD is one of many agencies that edits the photos before they submit them to search. And they heavily edit these photos. They might replace closed eyes in a probe photo with open eyes. They'll cut and paste someone else's eyes into the suspect's photo before searching for that person. Or they might use, some agencies use forensic sketches of faces in their face recognition system. Or they'll use, the NYPD has done what they call celebrity doppelganger searches. They will find somebody who looks like the suspect they're looking for and run that person's face through. It doesn't matter how accurate this technology gets. It's not magic. It can't interpret Woody Harrelson's face and say, oh, law enforcement's actually looking for somebody other than Woody Harrelson, but since they look alike, we're going to find the correct person. Doesn't matter how accurate the systems get. If you put in edited photos, sketches of faces, that type of thing, you're not going to get reliable results out.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense just based on what we know of like how other surveillance tools have been used. It's just sort of, it's like in the end, there are humans making the decisions about how to use these tools and who to use them on. And so we've seen, law enforcement agencies using stingrays and, surveillance technology that sweeps up people's text messages without warrants at protests or at, in low income communities. And so, it's just like, I think like the tech industry wants to put forward this sort of utopian vision of like, hey, like humans are biased. So like, let's like get robots to do these things for us. And like the robots won't be biased. And like, then we're going to solve all of these, forms of discrimination and oppression in our society. And like, everything's going to be great. It just time and time again, it just doesn't pan out that way. So I think, based on touching back to kind of what you were saying before as well, I do think it's important because I think we've often talked about facial recognition or just surveillance generally as sort of like, oh, this is like, we're heading for this dangerous future, right? Or like, people often will say, oh, like 1984 or like Minority Report or whatever, like as if this is something that's kind of coming down the road, but is not here yet. And I thought it was, the week after, your research led to that major report in the Washington Post. The Washington Post ran an editorial that basically said, the headline was like, the facial recognition nightmare we feared is here. And I do think that's really important. And, this is the first time I can tell folks this is technically under embargo until noon Eastern time today. But today, Fight for the Future is launching kind of the phase 2 of our Ban Facial Recognition campaign, where we're building actually on the map that Georgetown put together at perpetuallineup.org and integrating some other information and research that we've done on where facial recognition is happening and also where there are partnerships between Amazon Ring and local law enforcement. Amazon Ring doorbells conduct video surveillance. As of right now, as far as we know, they're not doing facial recognition directly within those products. But, since Amazon offers facial recognition, it's, they've filed a patent to do facial recognition with Amazon Ring. We're displaying those as sort of like, here's how this could continue to spread across the country. But part of the reason we're showing all of that information is because there's also been a lot of resistance to facial recognition happening at the local and state level. Oakland, California just became the 3rd city in the country to ban facial recognition use by government and law enforcement, I believe Wednesday night, right? Or Tuesday night, 2 nights ago. It's Somerville, Massachusetts, which is, I'm a stone throw from there right now. I'm in Cambridge. Was the 2nd city, and San Francisco, of course, was the 1st back in May. So there's been quite a lot of opposition spreading at the local and state level. But Claire, can you talk a little bit about both that reality that like, facial recognition is already happening in a lot of places, and maybe talk a little bit about some of, where is it happening? We've seen stories about airports, about casinos, about, stadiums, local law enforcement, the FBI, ICE. What are some of the like top ways that this is currently being used? And then also, what are you seeing in terms of resistance to this bubbling up at the local, state, and federal level?
So as a starting point for how widespread it is, think of a face photo database on file with an agency, the federal or state level, and chances are good it's now a face recognition database. This is passports, check, that's face recognition, visa photos, green card applications. The FBI has a face recognition database. 44 states at least have face recognition that runs in their driver's license. Against their driver's license photos, that's very typical. The purpose for that is to do fraud and deduplication, but as we're seeing, that's increasingly open for law enforcement to do searches for anything from, yes, criminals to the girlfriend of a suspected fugitive or somebody who liked somebody else's photo on Facebook, that type of thing. That's in the law enforcement and agency space. We estimated back in 2016, we estimated conservatively that 1/4 of all law enforcement agencies across the country have access to a face recognition system. that number in practice is probably much larger. Then in the commercial space, in the social media space, we're all very familiar with face recognition, thanks to Facebook. In the consumer product space, think of the iPhone 10 and its analogs with Face ID. Retail outlets are increasingly looking at face recognition. One of the use cases that we see interest around is the use of face recognition cameras at the at entrances to retail outlets to try to identify suspected shoplifters before they enter a store. This is a product that's being offered by face recognition companies. Where else? In the advertising space, casinos definitely use face recognition. We're seeing apartment buildings, apartment complexes looking into using face recognition as a security measure. Schools are looking into face recognition as a security measure, or as a way to track attendance, that type of thing. Airports, yes, DHS has, or CBP has biometric exit and entry. Biometric exit would take the photo of every passenger exiting the country and compare that against their biometric information on file. So yeah, it's here and it's very widespread. It affects probably most of us by now in one way or another. And the question is that something we want? Or should there be bans on it? Should there be very strict rules around how it should and should not be used? We're only just beginning to have those conversations. As you mentioned, there is a fair amount of pushback. We've seen these bans happen in 3 cities already. We've seen interest in legislation. The first bill, I think, there was a bill in Maryland introduced in 2017, which would have comprehensively regulated the use of face recognition by law enforcement. We've seen some interest at the federal level to either curtail the use of federal funds to purchase this technology. Most of face recognition systems used at the state and local level are purchased with DHS funds or DOJ funds, probably. And we're seeing movements like the movement in Detroit to push for greater transparency and community input around the use of face recognition, which is incredibly important. In order for this to be a democratic process, it needs to be up to the communities to decide whether this should be used to police them and also when and how it should be used.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I assume that isn't how it's been so far. I mean, I was even just seeing a story out of Boise, Idaho, where, the mayor basically decided to purchase facial recognition for City Hall without even running it by the local city council. And, I know even just in the process of putting together this map that we're releasing today, most of the information we only know because of FOIA requests or, hard work from folks like you all that had to do quite a bit of digging to find this information. So, law enforcement is not being forthcoming about how they're doing it, what they're doing, unless they're basically pushed to. So I do think, that level of community activism is really important. And that's why we're going to have a guest joining us soon from Detroit, who's part of the community groups there that have been fighting this at the local level. So that'll be really awesome to get a chance to chat with her. Really quick, I just wanted to go back to, when you're talking about airports, what I've been hearing from law enforcement, kind of like the opposition here is sort of like, oh, everyone's making too big of a deal out of this. Like, this isn't any different than, you go to the border agent and you hand them your passport. It has your photo on it. They look at it. They look at you. This is just making that faster and more convenient. It's going to be better for everyone. Can you explain, like, why is it different? Why is it different to have an algorithm do this than to have, just like a border agent or a police officer look at a photo that's been taken of a suspect and compare it against, a database of mugshots that they presumably already have, or against, driver's license databases or other databases of photos that the government already has? Can you, why is this so much more dangerous and invasive?
I think there is a world in which the use of face recognition in airports is mostly a convenience and speeds up a process. The concern is by automating a process, by collecting data, biometric data about people, it becomes a question of how that information can be used in other ways beyond just the purported use. When a gate agent looks at your passport, that is a one-off transaction, and that information isn't used elsewhere. So the question does become, what is happening with this other data? How can it be mobilized in other ways? And then the other question is, face recognition is not terribly accurate. It may be, we don't know what the racial bias rates within the CBP agent looking at people's passports and deciding whether or not there's a match is. We can actually get a sense for what that is with face recognition. And right now, we're still looking at a system that may disproportionately impact certain people because of how they look. And I would just caution against that. That benefits nobody. That does not benefit us for security purposes to have a system that we know just doesn't perform as well on certain people. And it doesn't benefit us from a convenience standpoint either, or from a societal perspective to have, let's say, dark-skinned women disproportionately pulled out of a line and needing to be fingerprinted before they get on a plane or something like that. The other practical reality of biometric exit of the use of face recognition in airports is, my personal opinion is that it's a colossal waste of money and it's not going to scale. They're spending over $1 billion on this system to replace something that agents do right now anyway. The secondary check appears to have the secondary check for people whose faces don't match for non-Americans looks like it's going to be fingerprinting. And the question is, given the accuracy rates or the misidentification rates of face recognition, does that mean they're going to have CBP officers at every gate with a fingerprint scanner? Is that actually going to scale, or is that just going to become phenomenally expensive? So I know it's not a privacy concern, but it's a fiscal responsibility concern. I don't actually see this as solving a problem, and I see it as being phenomenally expensive when we could spend that money on other things.
Yeah, it seems, I mean, that just underscores so many costs to our society for implementing this technology. The monetary cost probably pales in comparison to the broader cost of basic freedom and civil rights, but an important one to note. Tawana, it looks like we've got you here. Hi, thanks so much for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, super amped. So for folks who are watching, we have with us Tawana Petty, who is the director of Data Justice Programming at the Detroit Community and Technology Project. I've got it right here. Did I get that right?
Yeah,
also
it's long.
a poet and an organizer. I was checking out your stuff. So a fellow artist and an activist, and we're super excited to have you here. We've been talking with Clare Garvie from the Georgetown Law Center for Privacy and Technology, who've been doing phenomenal work exposing the ways that law enforcement agencies are using facial recognition across the country, particularly this recent major story about ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, using it to target undocumented people, even in states where they're legally allowed to get driver's licenses or driving cards. So Clare, thanks so much. Again, feel free to stick around if you want to continue kind of jumping in the conversation, and if you need to get on to other things, that's okay as well. Or really quick, Clare, before we move in, and Tawana, I really want to ask you some questions about what's been happening in Detroit and Michigan. But Clare, just where can people find you on the internet, or follow Georgetown, or how can folks connect with you?
Sure. Twitter's probably the fastest way, and since we're on Twitch, I'll mention I'm at Clare Angelin, ClareAngelyn, and our center is at Georgetown CPT.
Awesome. Maybe Joe, you can drop that in the chat for folks who want to follow Clare. That would be awesome. So Tawana, again, thank you so much for joining us. It was very fortuitous because we're we're looking at this mostly at the national level, but like literally just yesterday, I was like, man, like these folks in Detroit are like making some noise. Like we've got to get in touch with them and like see, how we can support this amazing activism that's happening on the ground there. And then you emailed me. So
Yeah.
I love it. And yeah, I mean, can you just give us a quick sense, first of all, what's happening? It sounds like this is not a future threat right now. Law enforcement in Detroit and Michigan are already using facial recognition. So can you talk to us about that? Like what's happening in your city and why are you concerned about it?
Yeah. First of all, let me say thank you for having me. And also I want to thank Claire and her teams. We give much gratitude for them amplifying what's happening in Detroit. It was really tremendous in helping us with our groundwork here. And so we're forever indebted to them for that. I'll start with the fact that since 1998, which Claire referenced in her talk, since 1998, Michigan Secretary of State has given every digital photo in Michigan to Michigan State Police for facial recognition. So for the last 30 years in Michigan, state IDs have been given over to Michigan State Police. And Michigan State Police has been using facial recognition since 2001. So I'll preface with that. Of course, that's not knowledge I had before recently, but it's knowledge I have now. Moving forward in Detroit since 2016, Detroit has rolled out what's called Project Greenlight. And Project Greenlight is this, we liken it to the lantern laws, essentially, where, back in the 1800s, if you were a Black male, you had to hold a lantern in front of your face so that white residents or citizens would not fear you. Like if you weren't in the presence of a white person, you had to have a lantern in front of your face. And so with Project Greenlight, there's these green flashing lights that they put in particular neighborhoods within the city to amplify that this is a crime-ridden area, a low-income area, an area to be wary of, and that's under 24/7 police real-time surveillance. Mm-hmm. When they launched this campaign, because of the massive propaganda assault that Detroit has undergone for about a half century, a lot of residents were jumping at the bit to be, part of this. Like, wait, we're going to have like these protections, right? It's the typical conflation between safety and security. We use security in order to amplify that there might be some aspect of safety involved, but really it's just protection of property. And so what they didn't say, though, to these community members, these businesses, was that facial recognition was a part of that process. So with all these cameras being, and now over 500 businesses, including some schools and apartment buildings, low-income housing, with these cameras all throughout the city, the Detroit Police Department has been using it to pull their images for facial recognition. So they're in contract with DataWorks. It's an over $1 million contract where not only do they have access to that technology for any camera that is connected to it, but they also have mobile access, unlimited users. And so you have officers and some civilians who have access via their cell phone to this technology. And so somebody could be sitting up in their living room, essentially, looking at Greenlight cameras. And so we're on a massive campaign. I'm part of a coalition called Blackout Greenlight Coalition. And among others who we've started a petition. We have almost 600 signatures. We just started the petition a few days ago. And that is to amplify two bills. One is a Senate Bill 342, which is a total ban on facial recognition. That is a bill by Senator Lucido and this is a Republican senator, and it's co-sponsored by a Democratic senator, Stephanie Chang. Mm-hmm. And there's a second bill, House Bill 4810, which is State Rep Isaac Robinson, and that's co-sponsored by Jewel Jones, State Rep Jewel Jones, and State Rep Sherry Gay Delgado. So we're trying to get folks to reach out to their legislators, get these bans in place. The first bill is a total ban. The second bill is a 5-year moratorium on police use of facial recognition technology. And then City Council is now looking at potential ordinances. We're trying to push them to move for a ban as well. The problem is they approved Greenlight with facial recognition technology. And now that this is all out and amplified in the public, of course, there are folks, backtracking now and saying, hey, we didn't know that this was not approved by Board of Police Commissioners, as if that's a valuable argument to giving money to this technology. And I'll finally say, now our chief of police is pushing for an additional $4 million to expand his facial recognition real-time crime centers in 2 separate precincts in the city. And so they're just moving full speed ahead despite community opposition. They're using arguments like we won't use live stream video, as if the racial bias didn't originate with still photos. They're just using a lot of arguments that to a person who's not researched or doesn't know about this technology sound like valuable arguments. But thankfully to folks like Georgetown, to folks like Joy at MIT, to you all, we have the consciousness to struggle against these technologies and fight for our future, essentially. And so just really grateful to be in conversation and a robust debate on this finally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you touched on so many important points there. I mean, one, just to pull out, you noted that the statewide ban legislation is bipartisan. It's co-sponsored by a Republican and a Democrat, which is something that we're seeing at the federal level as well, where, like Jim Jordan, who, I'm not going to lie, I probably don't agree with anything else that he has ever said in his entire life, is out there agreeing with like AOC that this is dangerous technology that, invades our basic rights. And I think, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, I mean, something we can all agree on is that we don't want our government tracking our every move and invading these private spaces that are so important for our basic liberty. But obviously, I think it's, while this does affect everyone, I think it, and as you noted and Claire noted, I mean, look, let's just be real. It affects some of us more than others, right? And so, I mean, Detroit obviously is a city with a long history of, frankly, racist policing and over policing of Black community and low-income communities and communities of color. I mean, are you seeing impacts of this already? I mean, what's like the impact on people knowing that this facial recognition is happening? And are you seeing it, how are you seeing it play out for folks on the ground?
Well, I can honestly tell you about a year ago, and even months ago, we were getting like really hateful responses to our activism, like folks going like, you just don't want us to be safe and stop resisting the police. They're doing a great job. And, these sorts of arguments that weren't really connected to reality. I would say they were mostly fed by propaganda, by, police campaign, mayor campaign. Our chief of police is the deputy mayor here. So, so the mayor and the chief, they basically have the same narrative consistently, and community members fed into that. But I think now as consciousness is raising, as they're seeing these other cities ban facial recognition, as they're seeing Axon pull the technology from body cameras, and these different acts around the world that are resisting this and amplifying how invasive, racially biased, and harmful this technology is, we're having way more robust discussions. Like our last 2 Board of Police Commissioner meetings, like most of the people who stood up were objecting to the technology. And that's very new. That's very new. And then we've been informing them about the repercussions of trying to resist this technology. If you look at London, which has proven to be 96% inaccurate, and seeing that they're starting to fine people for covering their faces and taking folks to court. Even the activists are going like, wait, I thought that a solution was just covering my face. And now I'm seeing that there are places that will criminalize you for that. Or if you look at China, that's pursuing Muslims using facial recognition, or ousting low income community members or community members who they don't find as viable human beings, and how they're being further marginalized using this technology. You look at a city like Detroit, where the median income is $26,000 a year. I mean, this is literally one fell swoop and a flick of a button. You could totally marginalize the entire city. We're 80+% Black. We're 700,000 Black people in this city. And Project Greenlight was the first of its kind in our city to have that component in addition to facial recognition technology. I always tell people that it likens me to the Tuskegee experiment. Like, this feels like the largest experiment on Black people in modern history in the United States. And I can't stress enough how important it is to resist this on all levels. And we know that if they're successful here, then they'll just roll it out to Muslims here too. I mean, Dearborn is literally 15 minutes from here. So, I mean, there's just so many, and then our undocumented community members in Southwest Detroit. So, I mean, there's a lot to be fearful of, but like our comrades with Stop LAPD Spying saying, we're going to move from power, not paranoia. We're shifting from paranoia to power, and we're going to continue to resist this. And we know that the lies within the narrative campaign that the city government is using is a response to us winning. And the fact that there's legislation out here, the fact that folks are talking about this, is just a far cry from where we were a year ago.
You're giving me chills. And it is, yeah. I mean, I saw in your bio that, you know, you're a mother. I'm a parent too. And when I just think about, like what kind of world I want my child to grow up in.
My child's in Chicago, if that gives you any indication of how fearful I am day in and day out.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, he's an adult now, but, you know, always my child. But he's in Chicago, where very similar campaign to Detroit, and probably even more aggressive on some levels. Their media campaign and narrative is a little younger than ours, but I know what it feels like to live in a city where the whole world looks at you as an eyesore and something to be discarded. And so that's why they're allowed to do these things to us. But our community members are growing into their consciousness about this, and they'll fight back.
And I think that's such an important point. And, you know, another place that we've seen facial recognition being deployed and spreading is at the U.S. border.
We're definitely a border city too.
We saw recently even, you know, Democratic leadership at the federal level, you know, really kind of endorsing this idea of like, well, you know, as an alternative to this ridiculous wall that Trump's calling for, let's just deploy more surveillance technology. And one of the, you know, arguments or, you know, points that a lot of organizations put out was, look, once you deploy this technology at the border, it doesn't stay there. It's, you know, soon going to show up in cities targeting low-income populations. And I think, you know, the same is true. Like you said, Detroit is an experiment. And if it goes well, from law enforcement's perspective, then they're going to spread it to other cities as well. So, you know, if you're sitting wherever you are in you know, Seattle thinking, oh, well, I'm in Seattle, I'm good. You know, it's only a matter of time. You know, so that's why it's so important that we rally behind folks like you all that are on the ground fighting this at the local level. I mean, really quick, Clare, since we still have you, you know, how common is like what Tawana is describing in Detroit? Like, how many other cities are doing, you know, fairly similar things?
So in terms of what the law enforcement agencies are doing, the real-time use of face recognition, the use of this tool as a surveillance tool that can essentially be mobilized to identify people just walking down the street, that's not ubiquitous yet, but we've seen a handful of agencies who have purchased the technology. Detroit and Chicago have purchased very, very similar systems. Then Seattle actually did purchase the capability a while ago before walking back from that and eventually putting forward a policy that says they can't use the technology in that capacity. LAPD has talked about using that technology. The West Virginia Intelligence Fusion Center looks like they've purchased the technology. Dallas Area Rapid Transit was looking at purchasing this. And so the demand is definitely there and the supply is there too. Most major companies that sell face recognition to law enforcement sell the face surveillance component to the ability to do this live tracking as well.
Got it. And Tawana, from your perspective, again, it sounds like the city government is kind of trying to argue, oh, we're not doing this live tracking, but even assuming they're not, I think you articulated well why it's still dangerous. But why the fact it does seem like there's something a little different about the live tracking of biometric surveillance that raises alarm bells. Just speak to that. Like, how does that play out, in a community? Why is it so concerning, the idea that, that you're kind of this real-time surveillance is going on?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we don't believe them when they say that. It's what they're articulating, but they've been using it, and now, their argument is that they're not using it, but they paid to use it. I mean, it's within all the agreements, the contracts with DataWorks Plus, and within the proposals that they submitted for approval to the Board of Police Commissioners. But our fear is, Detroit is a robust activism city, always had a history of activism and social justice. And if we look at cities like Baltimore, where police officers use, and that's another thing, thanks to Georgetown for unearthing that. But when you look at cities like Baltimore, where police officers literally use their technology to track protesters who owed tickets, just scanning the crowd to find ways to further criminalize folks for civil disobedience. It's very concerning that an officer would have the ability. They could have a vendetta or whatever. These are still, human beings. These are humans who, are in a uniform with human emotions and human reactions and responses, and they have a capability on a cell phone to walk through a crowd and look for somebody they might despise, or if they're racially biased for whatever reason, or any other bias. Or I think about women who are suffering under domestic violence, and or just many reasons for this not to be a capability, to have someone just watching your every move, tracking your every move, able to use a technology and an algorithm to pursue you. Like Claire said, and like you've said, whether it's accurate or inaccurate, it needs to be banned. There is no good that can come of having government and law enforcement have access to this technology.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, I think that point about, police are people, and we know from other types of surveillance, even at the federal level, like NSA surveillance, that government agents have been repeatedly caught abusing the surveillance tools they have to spy on their ex-girlfriends or their business partners or their family. Humans are, when you give someone this type of power, it's very likely that they're going to abuse it, especially when it's at such a mass scale. And I think your point about, just protests and et cetera really, gets me as well. I just think, to me, it seems like privacy. We often talk about privacy as sort of like at a very consumer level, or kind of like, but the photos on my phone. I think of it at a kind of broader level, that like we need these private spaces that are free from government intrusion and even societal intrusion in order to progress as a society. Here we are 50 years after the Stonewall uprising. And imagine if the US government had ubiquitous facial recognition surveillance at a time when homosexuality was still criminalized in this country, right? Would the LGBTQ rights movement have ever formed in a world where, basically anyone that advocates for their basic rights could be easily rounded up and locked up and charged with a crime? We need sort of these spaces outside of the reach of government in order to test the boundaries of what is right and wrong, and challenge immoral laws. And it just feels like, if we head for a world with kind of where law enforcement approaches 100% ability to catch everyone for every single minor infraction, that's going to fill our prisons faster. And it basically means that we're going to be stuck as a society. We're never going to advance or progress or be able to, again, test the limits of whether the laws that we have in the books are actually moral and just, or whether they need to be changed. So, to me, it's it gets me right in the heart. This isn't just kind of it's creepy. To me, I think it's actually a fundamental issue that is going to determine the course of human history going forward. So I really am grateful to both of you all for all the work that you've been doing on it. We're coming up on kind of the end of our hour, but before we finish up, I want to make sure, Tawana, like, how can people support what you all are doing in Detroit? Like, where do we send money? Who do we tell, if we have friends and family that live in Michigan, where do we send them to sign the petition or take action? And how can we amplify and support this important work that you all are doing on the ground there?
Wonderful. Thank you. So our website is detroitcommunitytech.org, and on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, those technologies that we still use. It is DETCom Tech. And then also we want to shout out BYP 100 Detroit chapter. We want to lift up our Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, Detroit Coalition for Peace, and the Blackout Greenlight Coalition. Like, we are nothing by ourselves. This is coalition work, and it's tremendous and incredible opportunity to come together and be on the right side of history. And I'll finally say, we also want to lift up Color of Change for amplifying this petition for us. And so you can go to Color of Change's page and find our petition.
Awesome. That's great. And yeah, we're going to be collecting signatures at banfacialrecognition.com as well, which we'd be very happy, whenever you all go to do a delivery or something like that, we can add those in as well. So I know, this is kind of cool because it's like we were just emailing and now we're having a conversation in front of people, but I'm definitely going to shoot you an email. We're going to follow up and figure out how we can continue to amplify and support. And Joe hopefully can drop some of those links in the chat for folks who are watching so that they can click through and find you all and follow your work. And then kicking it back to you, Claire, really quick, we already kind of told folks where to follow you, but yeah, I mean, what comes next, or anything coming down the pike from Georgetown, or, or also just like what, for people who are sitting at home concerned about this, what do you think is the single most important thing for people, maybe who don't live in Detroit or don't live in Michigan or don't live in one of the cities or states where something's already happening? What should folks be doing?
Yeah, on that last point, if this topic is piquing your interest, if you're at all concerned, that's what public records requests are for. This is why I know what I know. It's by sending public records requests. It's your right to know how the government, not just how the government is using your tax dollars, but how they're policing you. So send a records request to your local police department. Figure out what they're doing, whether they've purchased this technology, and if they have, start calling for community engagement. The police are there to serve and protect and work for communities. It's not the other way around. So find out what information you can from them. It's not hard, and you don't have to be a lawyer. You literally just write an email or a letter saying, asking for the documents related to face recognition. I think that's the single most important way to get involved, is to arm yourself with information and to drill down on what's happening in your own communities. What's happening next on our front, we're continuing to dig into this issue, continuing to try to learn as much as we can about how this is used and how the information is shared, trying to get as many resources out there to help folks like Tawana and the amazing activists and advocates around the country in Detroit and elsewhere. Then we also do a lot of work with defense attorneys. So if you're a defense attorney or a public defender who's out there who may have face recognition in their case, I'm a resource for you. I will send you model motions to push the prosecution, because what we're finding is face recognition is not just not transparent to the public, it's not transparent to the people who are arrested and charged on the basis of a face recognition identification. And that's a constitutional violation. We have a right to that information under our right to a fair trial. So consider the Center on Privacy and Technology a resource in that capacity as well.
Excellent. Tawana, anything last to add before we finish up? I really appreciate both of you. This was like an awesome conversation, and I'm feeling pumped up. I'm feeling stoked to get this map out that we're putting up today at banfacialrecognition.com, and excited to just start pouring, there's little fires burning all over the country, and we got to just pour some gas on them in a nonviolent and supportive way.
I just want to say thank you both so much. And I want to say that this is a prime opportunity for bipartisan unity on this topic. I mean, the 4th and 14th Amendment rights, due process and privacy. Folks have a right to be proved to be innocent until proven guilty. And a lot of these laws need to be challenged. And so that's a longer battle, but for right now, we don't deserve algorithms predicting who's a criminal in this country. And I think that this is our one opportunity to really stand together, no matter what side of the aisle you're on. Amazing.
Well, thank you so much, Tawana Petty, Clare Garvie. It was really amazing to have you both on our live stream. And folks who are out there watching, we're going to be trying to do this every week, and we'll have guests every week. I'm sure we'll probably invite you both back at some point and be following up. But yeah, links in the chat for how to follow both of these amazing folks and the organizations that they're working with, and definitely subscribe to our Twitch channel so you can get notifications when we go live with live streams like this. And again, yeah, banfacialrecognition.com. We're going to try to make just like a hub site where you can take action and contact your local, state, and federal lawmakers all at the same time. Because in the end, there's a lot of activity happening in cities and states, but frankly, there's a reason that your local police department doesn't have fighter jets or nuclear weapons. Like, Congress absolutely has the authority to limit what local law enforcement has access to. And in the end, our federal lawmakers should move to stop this at the federal level so that no matter where you live, you're not subjected to this type of invasive and racially biased surveillance. So thank you both, and we'll definitely see you all again soon. And thanks to Joe behind the scenes, making everything happen with the live stream.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, y'all.
Thank you.